The carriage rattled to a halt in front of the mansion, the rhythmic clatter of wheels replaced by the soft hush of the wind stirring the trees. Genevieve stepped down, her boots crunching against the gravel of the circular drive. The grandeur of the estate unfolded before her like something out of a painting. Stone columns rose to meet a facade dripping with ivy, the windows gleaming faintly in the fading afternoon light. For a moment, she stood completely still, her breath catching in her chest. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, imbued with the weight of history and secrets. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and smoothed the front of her coat, her fingers brushing against the small brass clasp that held it shut. A single sunbeam broke through the canopy of clouds overhead, catching on the arched iron gates behind her, and she felt a fleeting sense of reassurance. This was exactly what she had been searching for: isolation, time to think, and in the depths of the mansion's famed library, a treasure trove of knowledge waiting to be unraveled. The butler, a tall, thin man with an austere expression and white gloves, greeted her at the entrance. "Miss Harrow, I presume. Welcome to Greythorne Manor," he said, his voice smooth and low, though it carried a faint note of curiosity. "The master has been expecting you. May I take your coat?" Genevieve hesitated, letting her gaze wander past the threshold. The entry hall stretched before her, a cavernous space filled with polished marble floors and a sweeping staircase carved from dark, gleaming wood. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations from the high ceiling, their prisms scattering light across the room. Despite herself, Genevieve couldn't suppress the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was excessive, ostentatious even, but it promised solitude, and that was all she cared about. "Thank you," she murmured, slipping off her coat and handing it to the butler. Beneath it, her simple dress felt plain, almost out of place against the opulence surrounding her. Still, she straightened her spine, lifting her chin with quiet defiance. This was no time for intimidation, and certainly not by a house. The butler gestured for her to follow, leading her past a series of towering doors, each more elaborately carved than the last, until they reached the library. When he opened the door, Genevieve's breath caught again, but this time it was a sharp, audible gasp. Books. Thousands of them. The walls stretched upwards, crammed with volumes of every size and color, the shelves climbing so high they disappeared into shadow. Ladders on polished brass tracks lined the rows, and the scent of aged paper mingled with the faint tang of leather bindings. Here and there, soft pools of golden light spilled from ornate sconces, illuminating reading alcoves tucked into the corners. It was an oasis of quiet intellect, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. "Your study has been prepared in the East Wing, but you are, of course, welcome to begin your work here," the butler intoned, bowing slightly. "Should you need anything, simply ring the bell on the desk." Genevieve nodded, barely hearing him as she stepped into the room. She ran her fingers along the edge of a nearby table, her heart fluttering like a bird against its cage. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of stillness settle over her, a peace she had almost forgotten she needed. "Perfect," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the vast, echoing space. Genevieve brushed a strand of hair from her face, her eyes scanning the delicate, inked pages of a manuscript splayed open on the library's long mahogany table. She had barely begun to decipher the archaic handwriting when the sharp scrape of a chair against the floor interrupted her concentration. Glaring up, she spotted a man at the far end of the room, leaning casually against one of the shelves. He twirled what looked like a pen in his fingers, his dark curls tousled in a way that suggested either carelessness or deliberate effort. "Excuse me," Genevieve said, her voice clipped. "I believe this is a private workspace." The man's gaze shifted to her, his eyes glinting with curiosity and no small measure of mischief. "Private? This library belongs to the house, not to you," he replied, his tone light but edged with challenge. "Unless you've somehow managed to claim exclusive rights to the air in here as well?" Genevieve narrowed her eyes, her irritation rising. "I don't recall inviting commentary." He smirked and strolled toward her, his polished boots tapping softly against the floor. As he reached her table, he glanced down at the manuscript she was studying. "Ah, the Casterly Roll," he said, recognition flickering across his face. The infamous tournament records. Fascinating choice. I'm aware, Genevieve replied, her tone icy. I don't need a lecture. Relax, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I'm just impressed you found it. Most people wouldn't even know where to start looking. I'm not most people, she shot back, pointedly turning back to her work. There was a beat of silence, and for a moment she thought he might leave. Instead, he tilted his head, leaning slightly closer to read over her shoulder. You might want to double-check that section, he said, tapping the page lightly with his index finger. That score is wrong. Genevieve stiffened, her eyes snapping to his. Excuse me? Second match, House Draybridge versus House Milner, he explained, his tone maddeningly casual. The final score was 23-19. You've written 23-21. She stared at him, incredulous. You're mistaken. The records clearly indicate 23-21. Do they? His smile widened, infuriatingly smug. Or did you misinterpret the notation system? Early medieval scribes often used half-strokes to indicate forfeits. It's a common mistake. Genevieve rose abruptly from her chair, the legs scraping against the floor. I do not make mistakes, she said coolly, her voice low and sharp. And I certainly don't take unsolicited corrections from strangers. He straightened, unabashed by her glare. Adrian Blake, he said, extending a hand. Fellow historian and apparently your new favorite stranger. She ignored his hand. Genevieve Harrow, and I assure you, you're no favorite of mine. Adrian chuckled softly, withdrawing his hand. Suit yourself, but you might want to double-check that score, Miss Harrow. History has a way of being tricky. As he turned and sauntered off, Genevieve sank back into her chair, her cheeks burning with equal parts frustration and disbelief. The nerve of him. She flipped back to the beginning of the record, muttering under her breath. 23-21. But a flicker of doubt gnawed at her, and she found herself scanning the page once more. It was going to be a long stay at Greythorne Manor. The parlor was a riot of floral upholstery and porcelain figurines, the kind of suffocating elegance that made Genevieve feel as though the walls themselves were gossiping about her. She perched stiffly on the edge of her chair, forcing herself to nod politely as Lady Greythorne rattled on about the lineage of her prized rose garden. The elderly woman's voice wavered like the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, steady but brittle. Adrian, on the other hand, had settled into his seat with infuriating ease, one ankle crossed over his knee and a faint, amused smile playing at his lips. His dark eyes roved the room, landing occasionally on Genevieve as if to share some unspoken joke. She pointedly ignored him, her focus trained instead on the teacup in her hands, its delicate rim threatening to crack under her tight grip. And of course, Lady Greythorne continued, her watery blue eyes sparkling with delight, I simply must commend you both. Such a lovely thing to see young people working together so closely and with such devotion. Genevieve froze. I'm sorry, she managed, glancing up sharply. Lady Greythorne's smile widened, revealing slightly crooked teeth. Why, your partnership, my dear. It warms my heart. You're such a charming couple, the two of you. So refreshing to see scholars finding love amidst all that dusty parchment. Genevieve's breath caught in her throat. Oh, no, we're not, she began, her voice rising in alarm. Absolutely, Adrian interrupted smoothly, leaning forward in his chair as though he were settling into the role of a lifetime. Genevieve and I are very close. He shot her a sidelong glance, his grin widening at the way her mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. Lady Greythorne clapped her hands together, clearly delighted. I knew it. There's something in the way you look at each other. And the way you bicker, it's unmistakable. My late husband and I were the same. Oh, how we fought. But that's how you know it's real. Genevieve shot Adrian a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but he only shrugged, entirely unrepentant. Yes, well, we do have spirited debates, he said, the picture of charm. It keeps things lively. Adrian, Genevieve hissed under her breath, her tone dangerous. Genevieve, he replied softly, his tone maddeningly pleasant. Then louder to Lady Greythorne. You know, speaking of our work, we were both hoping to access the manuscript collection in the North Wing. I understand it's not typically open to visitors, but perhaps given our connection, you might make an exception? Lady Greythorne's expression softened. Oh, but of course, anything for my favorite couple. I'll have the keys sent to you first thing tomorrow. Genevieve felt her stomach churn as Lady Greythorne reached for the bell to summon the butler. Adrian leaned back in his chair, looking every bit the cat who had just swallowed the canary. She waited until the older woman was preoccupied with her instructions before rounding on him. "This is absurd," she whispered furiously. "I cannot believe I just secured us access to the rarest manuscripts in the house," he murmured back, his tone annoyingly self-satisfied. "You're welcome. I didn't ask for your help." "No," he said, his gaze flicking to her with an unreadable glint. "But you needed it." Genevieve opened her mouth to retort, but Lady Greythorne turned back to them, beaming. "It's settled, then. You two make such a perfect team." Genevieve's lips pressed into a thin line. Adrian, of course, had the gall to wink at her. It was going to be an impossibly long stay at Greythorne Manor. The ballroom was alive with the low hum of conversation, the rustle of fabric, and the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Genevieve stood near the edge of the room, her fingers curled stiffly around the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't touched. She adjusted the drape of her shawl, tugging it closer over her shoulders, as though it could shield her from the curious stares aimed her way. The scholars and socialites mingling under the glittering chandeliers were polite but pointed, their glances lingering just long enough to remind her she was under scrutiny, not for her expertise, but for her unexpected role as one half of the manor's newest and apparently most fascinating couple. "I see you're mastering the art of looking incredibly bored," Adrian's voice drawled beside her. She hadn't even noticed him approach. She turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "It's not boredom," she replied. "It's self-preservation." "Ah, yes," Adrian said, grinning as he plucked a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "Because nothing's more dangerous than a room full of academics and aristocrats gossiping over canapes." Genevieve didn't dignify that with a response, instead turning her attention back to the crowd. Adrian was maddening, but the weight of the guests' stares seemed to lessen with him standing beside her, as if he absorbed some of the attention by sheer force of personality. His crisp suit and easy posture made him look entirely at home in this gilded atmosphere, while she felt like an intruder, an errant note in a meticulously composed symphony. "Relax," he said, his voice softer now. "They don't bite, most of them anyway." She exhaled sharply, not quite a laugh but close enough to surprise herself. "I'm not worried about their teeth," she muttered, her gaze sweeping the room. "I just don't particularly enjoy being the subject of speculation." "Then give them something to talk about," Adrian said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Genevieve stared at him, her brows knitting in suspicion. "What are you doing?" "Playing our part," he replied with an infuriatingly charming smile. "Unless you'd rather they think we're already on the verge of a lover's quarrel." She hesitated, then grudgingly slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. His warmth was unexpected, steadying in a way she didn't know she needed. Adrian led her toward the center of the room, pausing just long enough to exchange pleasantries with a cluster of guests. He handled their remarks with practiced ease, deftly steering the conversation away from their fabricated relationship and towards safer topics like the mansion's architecture or the wine selection. Genevieve found herself oddly impressed, though she'd sooner swallow her pride than admit it. When they finally broke free of the group, Adrian leaned down, his voice low enough for her ears alone. "See? Not so bad." Genevieve arched a brow. "You seem to thrive on attention." He considered her for a moment, the teasing edge in his expression softening. "And you seem to go out of your way to avoid it." "Is that your expert analysis?" she retorted, her tone sharper than she intended. But Adrian didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he studied her with a quiet curiosity that unsettled her more than his usual antics. "You're better at this than you think," he said finally, his voice gentle. Before she could respond, he added with a grin, "Though your smile could use some work, less grimace, more charm." She rolled her eyes, but a tiny, reluctant smile tugged at her lips despite herself. Adrian caught it, and his grin widened in triumph. The string quartet struck up a waltz, and Adrian didn't hesitate. "Care to dance?" Genevieve froze. "Absolutely not." "Oh, come on," he said, his tone coaxing. "Part of the act, remember? Besides, it'll give them something new to whisper about. He was already leading her toward the dance floor, and before she could protest further, his hand settled lightly at her waist. She placed her free hand on his shoulder with the stiffness of someone bracing for impact, but Adrian's grip was steady, guiding her effortlessly into the rhythm of the music. "You're awful at following," he teased. "I don't follow," she shot back. "I lead." His laugh was low, almost a rumble. Noted. As they moved together, Genevieve realized, much to her annoyance, that Adrian was a graceful dancer, his steps sure and unhurried. There was a moment, a fleeting one, where she forgot about the stares, the whispers, even the pretense. For the briefest heartbeat, it was just the two of them, circling the polished floor under the golden light, and then the music ended, and the spell broke. Adrian stepped back, his hand lingering at her waist just a second too long before he released her. "Not bad, Miss Harrow," he said, his tone light but his gaze unreadable. Genevieve pulled away, her cheeks warm, though whether from exertion or something else she refused to consider. "Let's not make a habit of it," she said, smoothing her skirt. "Whatever you say," Adrian replied, his grin returning. But as they made their way off the dance floor, Genevieve couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted, a tiny crack in the carefully constructed facade they'd built. And judging by the flicker of something unspoken in Adrian's eyes, she suspected he felt it too. The library was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wooden beams and the faint rustling of pages as Genevieve turned another leaf of the manuscript before her. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, painting golden stripes across the dark floorboards. She shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the soft hum of Adrian's presence at the far end of the room. He'd been there for hours, scribbling in a notebook, flipping through books with an energy that managed to be both focused and restless. She tried not to notice him, but it was impossible not to. Genevieve glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He was leaning forward, the sunlight catching in his dark curls. His coat was draped carelessly over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with ink smudges. She caught herself staring and quickly turned her gaze back to her work, scolding herself. It wasn't that he was handsome, though he was, in an irritatingly effortless sort of way. It was something else, something in the way he seemed to inhabit the space around him without pretense. She hated that it made her curious. "Staring is impolite, you know," Adrian said without looking up, his voice breaking the silence. Genevieve stiffened, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I wasn't staring," she snapped, her tone sharper than intended. "You're just distracting." He glanced up at her then, one brow arching in amusement. "Distracting? I'm hardly making a sound." "Exactly," she muttered, turning another page with unnecessary force. "It's unnerving." Adrian chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. "You know, most people find silence conducive to work." "Most people don't have you looming about," Genevieve replied, though her words felt hollow even as she said them. The truth was, his presence wasn't entirely unpleasant, it was just disorienting. Adrian didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tipped his chair onto its back legs, balancing precariously as he studied her. She could feel his gaze lingering, but she refused to meet it, her eyes stubbornly fixed on the manuscript. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer this time. "What is it you're so determined to find, anyway?" She blinked, startled by the question. Looking up, she saw no trace of his usual teasing grin, just an open curiosity that caught her off guard. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, despite herself, she answered, "I'm trying to reconstruct the correspondence between the Viscount of Arbor and his allies during the rebellion of 1473. There are gaps in the existing records, letters that were lost or destroyed. If I can piece together their contents, it might change our understanding of the rebellion's timeline." Adrian tilted his head, considering her words. "So you're chasing ghosts?" She narrowed her eyes. "That's one way of putting it. I prefer to think of it as uncovering the truth." He smiled then, but it wasn't his usual smirk. It was smaller, almost wistful. "You're relentless, aren't you?" Genevieve frowned, unsure whether to take the comment as a compliment or an insult. "History demands precision. Or obsession," Adrian countered, his gaze steady. "What made you so determined to do this? To chase ghosts?" She opened her mouth to retort, but the question gave her pause. No one had ever asked her that before, not in a way that felt genuine. She looked down at her hands, tracing the edge of the paper before her. "History is safe," she said at last, her voice quieter than she intended. "It's already happened. It can't hurt you the way the present can." Adrian didn't respond immediately, and when she finally glanced up, she saw something in his expression she couldn't quite name. He looked at her not with the smugness she'd come to expect, but with something softer, more thoughtful. "That's a hell of a reason," he said finally, his tone low. The weight of his gaze made her uncomfortable, so she deflected. "And what about you, Mr. Blake? What's your grand purpose for skulking about libraries and correcting people's work?" His lips quirked into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I just like the sound of my own voice." She rolled her eyes. "I'm serious," he sighed, leaning forward again, his elbows resting on the table. "Fine, if you must know, I study history because it's full of stories people have forgotten. I like finding the pieces that don't fit, the cracks where people's lives spill through, the parts most people overlook." Genevieve stared at him, surprised. There was something in his voice, something unguarded and raw that she hadn't expected. "That's almost poetic," she said softly, before she could stop herself. Adrian gave her a crooked grin, the teasing spark returning to his eyes. "Careful, Miss Harrow. You almost sounded impressed." "Don't flatter yourself," she replied, but her tone lacked its usual bite. She returned her attention to her manuscript. But the room felt different now, the silence between them no longer strained. For the first time, she found herself wondering if Adrian's charm and bravado were as much a facade as her own guardedness. And from the way he glanced at her, his expression unreadable, she suspected he was wondering the same about her. It was going to be a long stay at Greythorne Manor, but perhaps not as insufferable as she'd first thought. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the garden in a soft amber glow as Genevieve stepped through the side door of the manor. She hesitated on the stone steps, clutching her shawl against the evening chill. The garden stretched out before her like something from a forgotten fairy tale, hedgerows winding into labyrinthine paths, roses blooming in bursts of crimson and gold, and the faint murmur of a fountain somewhere just out of sight. She hadn't planned to come out here. In fact, she hadn't even planned to leave the library tonight. But Adrian had insisted. "You're going to wither away in there," he'd said, standing in the doorway of the library with his arms crossed and that ever-present smirk tugging at his lips. "Even the most dedicated historians deserve a break. Come on, 10 minutes. You can scowl at me the whole time if it makes you feel better." She had reluctantly agreed, mostly to shut him up. But now, as she stood under the wide expanse of sky painted in hues of violet and orange, she couldn't quite bring herself to regret it. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of lavender and earth, a welcome change from the musty aroma of old books. Genevieve was startled from her thoughts by the crunch of gravel behind her. Adrian appeared, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat, his hair slightly mussed from the breeze. "Thought you might change your mind and retreat back to your precious manuscripts," he said, a teasing lilt in his voice. "I considered it," she replied, arching a brow. "But then I remembered how much you'd gloat." He chuckled, stepping down onto the path beside her. "Fair enough. Come on, then." Without waiting for her response, he started down one of the winding garden paths, his stride unhurried but purposeful. Genevieve sighed and followed, her boots crunching against the gravel. "Where exactly are you dragging me?" "You'll see," he said over his shoulder, his tone maddeningly cryptic. They walked in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and the distant splash of the fountain. Despite herself, Genevieve found her shoulders relaxing, the tension of the day slipping away with each step. She glanced sidelong at Adrian, who seemed unusually quiet, his gaze fixed ahead. Finally, they rounded a corner, and Genevieve stopped short. Before them was a small, tucked-away alcove formed by a ring of hedges. In the center, a wrought iron bench sat beneath an archway, entwined with ivy and blooming jasmine. A small table stood nearby, holding 2 glasses of wine and a plate of biscuits. She turned to Adrian, suspicion narrowing her eyes. "What is this?" he grinned, spreading his arms in a gesture of innocence. A peace offering. Or, if you prefer, a bribe. Thought you might be less inclined to run back to the library if there was wine involved. Genevieve huffed, though she couldn't entirely suppress the faint smile tugging at her lips. You're ridiculous. Possibly, he admitted, taking a seat on the bench and gesturing for her to join him. But you're the one who agreed to come along, so what does that say about you? She rolled her eyes but sat down, tucking her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Adrian poured the wine, handing her a glass with exaggerated flourish. She accepted it, eyeing him warily as he settled back and took a sip of his own. For a while, they simply sat there, the quiet of the garden wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Genevieve found herself relaxing more than she expected, the wine warming her from within. Adrian, for once, seemed content not to speak, his gaze wandering over the flowers in the sky above. Finally, he broke the silence. You know, you're not what I expected. She turned to him, frowning. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. When I first met you, I thought you were, well, let's just say tightly wound, but you're not entirely anyway. Genevieve scoffed. And you're an expert on me now, are you? Hardly, he said, his tone light, but I'm observant. For example, I've noticed that you don't actually hate people as much as you pretend to. You're just cautious. She opened her mouth to retort, but found herself hesitating. It was disarming, the way he said it, not as a challenge or a jab, but as an observation, simple and unassuming. Maybe, she admitted quietly, surprising herself. Adrian's smile widened, but he didn't press her. Instead, he leaned back, tilting his head to look up at the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the darkening blue. Do you ever let yourself just pause? He asked after a moment. Genevieve frowned. What do you mean? Moments like this, he said, gesturing vaguely to the garden around them. No books, no research, no deadlines, just being. She looked away, her fingers tightening around her glass. Not often. I thought as much, he said, his voice gentle. But maybe you should. You might find it's not so bad. She didn't reply, but something in his words stayed with her, lingering in the quiet spaces of her mind. They lapsed into silence again, but this time it felt companionable. The sharp edges of their usual banter softened by the stillness of the garden. When Genevieve finally allowed herself to look at him, she found Adrian watching her, his expression unreadable but lacking its usual smirk. For once, he didn't say anything clever or teasing. He just smiled, a small, genuine smile that caught her off guard. And for the first time since arriving at Greythorne Manor, Genevieve felt the faintest glimmer of trust. The library was quiet except for the soft scratching of quills and the occasional rustle of parchment. Adrian sat at the long table, his posture uncharacteristically stiff as he leaned over a manuscript, his brow furrowed in concentration. Genevieve sat across from him, completely absorbed in her own work, her lips pursed as she meticulously copied a section of text into her notebook. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, casting warm light across the scattered books and papers between them. You're holding the pen wrong, Genevieve said without looking up. Adrian froze mid-stroke. Excuse me? She glanced up at him briefly, her sharp eyes narrowing in that particular way that always made him feel like he'd done something wrong, even when he hadn't. Your grip. It's too tight. You'll tire your hand out before you finish the sentence. He stared at her, incredulous. I've been writing my whole life, Genevieve. I think I know how to hold a pen. She raised a single brow, unimpressed. Clearly not if you're pressing so hard the nib is about to snap. Adrian scowled, glancing down at the ink pooling dangerously at the edge of the page. Muttering something under his breath, he adjusted his grip. Happy? I'll be happy when that manuscript doesn't look like it's been attacked by a rogue inkwell. Such faith in my abilities, he muttered sarcastically, brushing a stray curl off his forehead. Genevieve smirked faintly and returned to her work, the faint scratch of her quill filling the silence again. For a time, Adrian managed to focus, though the work felt heavier than it should have. The notes he'd taken over the past few days, a chaotic maze of half-formed ideas and scattered references, seemed to taunt him from the edge of the table. He couldn't deny it anymore. He was stuck. Why are you even bothering with that draft? Genevieve said suddenly, her tone casual but her eyes sharp as they flicked to his haphazard notes. Adrian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, it's obvious you're trying to force something that isn't working, she replied simply, gesturing toward the mess of papers. You're chasing the wrong angle, and it's holding you back. Her bluntness caught him off guard. Most people wouldn't dare criticize his methods, either out of politeness or fear of his sharp tongue, but Genevieve, of course, wasn't most people. He opened his mouth to argue, but found that no words came, because she was right, and what annoyed him most was that she knew it. So what? He said finally, his voice defensive. You think you know better? Not better, she said, shrugging lightly. Just different. Let me see what you've got. Adrian hesitated. There was something disarming about the way she asked, not as a challenge, but as an offer. With a sigh, he pushed the stack of notes toward her, watching as she flipped through them with the same focused intensity she gave to her own work. She frowned, tapping her finger against a particular page. This argument here, it's interesting, but it's buried under all this fluff. You're too caught up in the minutiae to see the bigger picture. Fluff? He repeated, offended. Those are carefully thought-out points. They're distractions, Genevieve corrected, her tone matter of fact. You're circling the real argument because you're afraid to commit to it. His jaw tightened. I'm not afraid of anything. Genevieve's gaze met his, unflinching. Then prove it. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling between them. Adrian stared at her, irritation warring with something deeper, something uncomfortably close to admiration. She had a way of seeing through him, peeling back the layers he used to shield himself. And infuriatingly, she was almost always right. Finally, he exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. Fine. What's your suggestion, then? She leaned forward, her tone softening as she began to explain. Together, they sifted through his notes, isolating the strongest points and discarding the rest. Genevieve's insights were sharp and precise, her mind working in a way that both challenged and inspired him. For the first time in days, the fog in Adrian's mind began to clear. Ideas took shape under her guidance, and he found himself seeing his work through her eyes, focused, unyielding, and strangely exhilarating. Hours passed without either of them noticing. The library grew dim as the sun dipped below the horizon, but neither of them stopped. By the time Genevieve sat back with a satisfied nod, Adrian's notes were transformed into something coherent, something that finally felt like it had purpose. There, she said, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. That's better. Adrian stared at the revised draft, a strange mix of gratitude and annoyance swirling in his chest. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. You're insufferable, you know that? Genevieve smirked. And you're welcome. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Remind me never to underestimate you again. That would be wise, she replied, her smile widening just enough to soften the usual edge of her demeanor. For the first time since arriving at Greythorne Manor, Adrian felt something shift. Genevieve wasn't just a rival or a reluctant collaborator. She was his equal, and if he was being honest with himself, maybe even the kind of ally he hadn't realized he needed. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its golden light casting flickering shadows across the walls of the small sitting room. Genevieve sat curled in one of the armchairs, her legs tucked beneath her, a book balanced precariously on her knees. She wasn't truly reading, though. The words had long since blurred into meaningless shapes as the heavy silence of the room pressed around her. Across from her, Adrian lounged on the sofa, one arm draped along the back, a half-empty glass of brandy cradled in his hand. It was one of the few moments they had spent together, without the pretense of being a couple, weighing over them. The day had been exhausting, filled with carefully constructed lies and social maneuvering to maintain their charade. Now, with no audience in sight, the air between them felt strangely fragile, like a thread stretched too tightly, threatening to snap. Genevieve turned the page of her book, though she had no idea what was on it. Her gaze flicked upward, stealing a glance at Adrian. He was staring into the fire, the amber glow illuminating his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the faint furrow that had settled between his brows. He looked uncharacteristically serious, almost pensive. and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, the sight of it unsettled her. "Thinking of your next brilliant quip?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, carrying none of its usual bite. Adrian turned his head, blinking as though pulled from his thoughts. His lips curved into a small, lopsided smile, but it lacked the usual teasing sparkle. "Tempting," he replied, his tone soft. "But no, even I have my moments of silence, believe it or not." Genevieve tilted her head. "Color me shocked." She tried to sound lighthearted, but something in his expression made her hesitate. "What is it, then? You've been unusually quiet tonight." Adrian studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. He took a slow sip of his brandy, then swirled the liquid in his glass, watching it shift and catch the firelight. "Do you ever wonder," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant, "what happens when all of this ends?" Genevieve blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "The act, the pretending. At some point, Lady Greythorne is going to realize we're not actually blissfully in love." Genevieve frowned, shifting in her chair. "I imagine we'll explain ourselves, apologize profusely, and go our separate ways." Adrian's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no trace of mischief in his expression. "And that's what you want?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than it had any right to be. Genevieve opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. What did she want? The thought of this whole charade unraveling and returning to her quiet, solitary life, the life she'd always preferred, should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Not entirely. She faltered, her fingers toying with the corner of her book. "I came here for the research, for the solitude. That's all I ever wanted." "And now?" Adrian asked softly, leaning forward slightly, his glass forgotten on the table. Genevieve hesitated, her chest tightening under the weight of his gaze. She wanted to say that nothing had changed, that she still craved the simplicity of being left alone with her work. But that wasn't the whole truth. Somewhere along the way, Adrian had wormed his way past her defenses, his presence no longer an intrusion, but something she found herself looking forward to. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. He leaned back, running a hand through his curls as he exhaled. "For what it's worth," he said after a moment, "this hasn't been as unbearable as I expected." Genevieve couldn't help the soft laugh that escaped her. "High praise." "I mean it," he said, his tone more earnest now. "You're not what I thought you'd be." Genevieve arched a brow. "And what did you think I'd be?" "Cold, detached, completely insufferable," he replied, though his smile softened the words. "But you're not. You're passionate, brilliant, and occasionally even kind." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked away, suddenly finding the pattern of the rug very interesting. "Don't get used to it," she muttered, but there was no real sting in her voice. Adrian chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Too late." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles when words are no longer needed, when two people understand each other in a way they hadn't before. Genevieve let the moment stretch, her gaze drawn to the fire as her thoughts swirled. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "Genevieve." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "If this were real..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening, as though the words were difficult to say. Her breath caught, her heart thudding in her chest. The firelight flickered between them, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. But before either of them could speak again, the distant chime of the manor's clock broke the spell, its echo reverberating through the quiet room. Genevieve cleared her throat, dropping her gaze. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Adrian hesitated, then nodded, his expression unreadable. "Right, of course." As they stood and gathered their things, neither of them spoke about the moment they'd just shared. But as Genevieve left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the line between pretense and reality had blurred in a way they could no longer ignore. The library was in chaos. The polished mahogany tables, usually adorned with carefully arranged manuscripts and quills, were bare, save for a few scattered ink pots and crumpled notes left in haste. Lady Greythorne's voice, usually quavering with warmth, now trembled with outrage as she addressed the gathered scholars. "A priceless manuscript, the Chronicle of Average, has gone missing," she announced, her tone severe. Her hands, frail but steady, gripped the back of a chair for support. This is an unforgivable breach of trust. Genevieve stood near the edge of the room, her shoulders tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. Adrian was at her side, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Both of them were silent, though Genevieve could feel the weight of the stares aimed in their direction. "It's no secret," a nasal voice piped up from the other side of the room. Dr. Whitaker, a historian whose sour disposition matched his permanently furrowed brow. "That Mr. Blake and Miss Harrow have been less than conventional during their stay." He gestured vaguely but deliberately toward the two of them. Genevieve's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me?" Whitaker adjusted his spectacles, his expression smug. "You've both been seen skulking about the mansion at all hours, whispering in corners, disappearing for no apparent reason. And now, a manuscript goes missing? Highly suspicious, wouldn't you agree?" Genevieve opened her mouth to retort, but Adrian spoke first, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "If by skulking you mean working, then yes, we're guilty as charged. But accusing us of theft? That's absurd." Whitaker's thin lips curled into a smirk. "Is it? You've hardly made a secret of your unusual relationship." The word dripped with disdain. "Who's to say it isn't all an elaborate ruse to cover up less noble intentions?" Genevieve's cheeks burned, a mix of fury and indignation swelling in her chest. "How dare you?" she snapped. "We've done nothing but work tirelessly since we arrived. I won't stand here and be slandered without evidence." "And yet," Whitaker pressed, "the two of you are the only ones without alibis for last night's theft." "All right, enough," Adrian said sharply, stepping forward. His calm veneer was cracking, his frustration evident in the tightness of his voice. "If you're so sure we're guilty, where's your proof? Or are baseless accusations the best you've got?" Lady Greythorne raised a frail hand, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the room. Her expression was grave as she looked between Adrian and Genevieve. "Until the manuscript is recovered," she said, "I'm afraid suspicion will fall on everyone. But given the peculiar nature of your recent behavior, I expect you both to cooperate fully in the investigation." Genevieve's stomach churned, but she squared her shoulders. "Of course," she said tightly. Adrian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the room, his voice steady but cold. "We'll find the real thief," he said. "Count on it." The scholars murmured among themselves as Lady Greythorne dismissed the gathering. Genevieve and Adrian exchanged a look, one of shared determination and unspoken understanding. They had no choice now. To clear their names, they would have to uncover the truth themselves. The library was shrouded in darkness, the faint moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. Genevieve adjusted the grip on her lantern, the flickering light illuminating the determined set of her jaw. Adrian trailed behind her, his own lantern swaying in his hand, the golden glow barely softening the sharp lines of his face. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but not without skepticism. Genevieve didn't stop. "I told you." The ledger from the East Wing inventory mentioned a second copy of the Chronicle of Avarice, one that predates the missing manuscript. If anything in this house points to who might have taken it or why, it'll be hidden in the archives below. Adrian hummed faintly, his boots echoing softly against the marble floors as they crossed the library's vast expanse. "And how exactly do you know the archives below even exist?" Lady Greythorne didn't exactly hand us a floor plan. Genevieve shot him a sharp look over her shoulder. "I'm a historian, Adrian. I read, I research, I piece things together. It's what I do." "And here I thought you just enjoyed bossing me around," he quipped, though his tone lacked its usual edge. Genevieve rolled her eyes, but before she could reply, she came to a halt in front of a towering bookshelf tucked into the far corner of the library. It was older than the others, its wood darker, its carvings more intricate. She set the lantern down on a nearby table and began running her fingers along the edges of the shelf, her brow furrowed in concentration. Adrian watched her for a moment before crossing his arms. "I hope you're not about to suggest we start pulling random books and hope the wall magically opens." "Don't be ridiculous," Genevieve murmured, her fingers pausing on a small, nearly invisible notch carved into the wood. "It's this one." She pressed the notch firmly, and with a faint groan of ancient hinges, the bookshelf shifted, swinging inward to reveal a narrow stone staircase descending into shadow. Adrian's eyebrows shot up. "I stand corrected." Genevieve smirked faintly, picking up her lantern once more. "Come on." The air grew cooler as they descended, the faint scent of damp stone mingling with the ever-present musk of aged paper. Their footsteps echoed faintly, the sound swallowed quickly by the heavy silence of the passage. The staircase twisted and turned, narrowing until they had to walk single file. Adrian, trailing behind, spoke just loud enough to be heard over the sound of their steps. "You know, for someone who claims to prefer solitude, you have an uncanny knack for dragging people into secret tunnels." Genevieve huffed a quiet laugh. "You're welcome to turn back if you're scared." "Scared?" Adrian's voice was all mock indignation. "I've faced far worse than dusty archives and your biting commentary." They reached the bottom of the staircase, where the passage opened into a sprawling chamber lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one packed with books, scrolls, and ledgers. Dust sparkled in the lamplight, disturbed by their arrival. The room felt untouched, as though it had been waiting for someone to rediscover it. Genevieve's eyes lit up, her earlier tension melting away as she took in the sight. "Imagine what's been forgotten down here," she murmured, more to herself than to Adrian. Adrian stepped around her, his lantern casting long shadows across the shelves. "Let's focus on what's been stolen," he said, though there was a note of awe in his voice as well. "Where do we start?" Genevieve set her lantern on a central table and began scanning the nearest shelf. The ledger mentioned correspondence between the mansion's original owner and a scholar who worked on the Chronicle. If anyone knew something about the manuscript's significance, it would be them. Look for anything with dates around 1625. Adrian didn't hesitate, moving to the opposite side of the room and pulling down a stack of dusty scrolls. "You know," he said as he worked, "if this doesn't prove our innocence, at least we'll have discovered an entire archive no one's touched in decades. That has to count for something." Genevieve shot him a quick smile. An optimist. How refreshing. For a while, the only sounds were the rustle of parchment and the faint scrape of wood as they shifted books and scrolls. Genevieve was the first to break the silence, her voice tight with frustration. "Nothing here connects to the theft, just endless catalogs of estate holdings and... wait." Adrian looked up, catching the change in her tone. "What is it?" Genevieve held up a brittle piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. "It's a letter, from the scholar I mentioned. He references a disagreement with Lord Greythorne about the manuscript." Adrian moved to her side, leaning in to read over her shoulder. "What kind of disagreement?" Genevieve's eyes flicked across the page, her brow furrowing. "It's unclear. Something about the manuscript containing classified information? That doesn't make sense." Adrian straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Unless the thief knew exactly what they were looking for. Something hidden within the manuscript itself." Genevieve's grip on the letter tightened. If that's true, then this wasn't just a crime of opportunity. This was planned. A faint sound, a creak, subtle but unmistakable, broke the silence, and both of them froze. Adrian's hand moved instinctively to his lantern, lifting it higher to cast the light farther. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Genevieve's pulse quickened, but she steadied her voice. "Then we'd better figure out what they're after. Quickly." As the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere deeper in the archives, the two exchanged a determined glance. They had come this far, and neither was willing to back down now. The storm outside was relentless, rain lashing against the tall windows of the sitting room as thunder rolled in the distance. The fire in the hearth burned low, its embers casting a faint, flickering glow across the room. Genevieve sat cross-legged on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring into the flames as though they might offer answers. Adrian sat a few feet away, his back resting against the edge of the sofa, silent for once. The air between them was thick with unsaid things, tension coiling like a spring waiting to snap. "I'm tired," Genevieve said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes didn't leave the fire. "Tired of pretending, of constantly defending myself, of this. Adrian looked at her, his dark eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You mean us," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her throat tightening. "It started as a lie, didn't it? Just a game to get what we wanted. But now," she trailed off, her hands gripping her knees more tightly. "Now I don't know where the lie ends and the truth begins." Adrian shifted, turning to face her fully. The usual teasing spark in his gaze was gone, replaced by something raw, something vulnerable. "Neither do I," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I know this. These weeks with you, as maddening as you are, they've been different. You're different." Genevieve's breath hitched as his words hung between them, fragile and exposed. Slowly, she met his gaze. "I don't want it to be pretend anymore." Adrian exhaled, a soft, almost disbelieving laugh escaping him. He reached out, his hand brushing hers where it rested on her knee. "Genevieve," he said, his voice unsteady, "I've been waiting for you to say that." She let out a shaky laugh in return, the corner of her mouth lifting in a hesitant smile. For the first time, the weight between them seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something real. The grand hall was silent, except for the steady clicking of Genevieve's boots against the marble floor as she and Adrian strode toward Lady Greythorne's study. In her hand, Genevieve held the damning letter, its yellowed edges trembling slightly as her grip tightened. Adrian walked beside her, his jaw set, his usual playful demeanor replaced by sharp focus. They reached the heavy oak door, and Adrian rapped twice before pushing it open. Inside, Lady Greythorne sat behind her ornate desk, flanked by several scholars, including Dr. Whitaker, who straightened at their entrance, his expression oozing suspicion. "Miss Harrow, Mr. Blake," Lady Greythorne greeted, her tone wary. "I trust you've come with an explanation?" "Oh, we have," Adrian said smoothly, stepping forward. "And it's one you'll want to hear." Genevieve placed the letter on the desk with deliberate precision. "This correspondence between Lord Greythorne and Scholar Braithwaite proves the stolen manuscript contained more than just historical records. It held encoded financial information, details tied to the Greythorne estate's dealings centuries ago." The room buzzed with murmurs, but Genevieve's voice cut through. "And we found the missing manuscript hidden in the archives, stashed behind a false panel." Her eyes flicked to Whitaker. "Or rather, where you stashed it." Whitaker's pallor drained, but he sputtered. "Preposterous!" "Really?" Adrian countered, holding up a ledger they'd recovered. "This ledger contains your annotations. You knew the manuscript could expose decades of fraud tied to your department's funding. You planned to destroy it." Lady Greythorne's gaze hardened, and she turned to Whitaker. "Is this true?" Whitaker stammered, but the evidence was overwhelming. Silence fell as the weight of his guilt settled over the room. "Miss Harrow, Mr. Blake," Lady Greythorne said finally, her voice steady, "you've not only restored the manuscript, you've restored the truth, and for that, we owe you our gratitude." Genevieve and Adrian exchanged a glance, a quiet triumph shared between them. For the first time, their work and their partnership felt wholly vindicated. The waves rolled in gentle rhythms, their soft murmurs mingling with the salt-tinged breeze. Genevieve sat cross-legged on the cool sand, her skirt fluttering lightly against her ankles. Beside her, Adrian stretched out lazily, propped up on his elbows, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky melted into the sea, streaked with hues of gold and lavender. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was soothing, a balm after the chaos they'd endured. Genevieve tilted her head, watching as the water lapped at the shore, the setting sun painting her skin in warm light. "I'm not sure how we got here," she said finally, her voice soft, almost carried away by the breeze. "But I'm glad we did." Adrian turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Who would have thought? You and me, playing detectives, fake lovers, partners in crime." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Turns out we're not so terrible at it." Genevieve glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Maybe because, somewhere along the way, it stopped being fake. His smile softened, and he reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers. "Here's to whatever comes next, then. No pretenses, just us." She laced her fingers with his, her heart light as the waves whispered their approval. "Just us."